Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm Mary Hines. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Studio 2. Lucien Bouchard, the opposition leader, has a leg amputated. What will his illness mean for national politics? A clear-cut issue. Can we save the forests? And the forest industry at the same time? And bringing a bit of circus to the dance. A new show by the choreographer of Cirque du Soleil.
There is shock in the nation's capital tonight at the news that Lucien Bouchard, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, is seriously ill. Bouchard had his left leg amputated today at a Montreal hospital. He had been suffering from phlebitis and the leg became infected. Tonight, the hospital says Bouchard is in serious but stable condition. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and Quebec's Premier Jacques Parizeau have expressed their sympathy. And in Ottawa, there is already, inevitably, speculation about what Bouchard's absence could mean for the cause of Quebec independence.
I'm joined tonight from Ottawa by our national affairs observers, Charlotte Gray, contributing editor of Saturday Night Magazine, Jeffrey Simpson, national columnist for The Globe and Mail, and Richard Cleroux, a freelance journalist. Welcome to all of you.
Hi, Mary.
Good evening.
Is this as much of a shock in Ottawa as it is in other parts of the province?
Yes, very much so, Mary. Parliament Hill is still reeling. We only found out a few hours ago. Even the Bloc Québécois caucus believed that the reason that Bouchard had missed Parizeau's speech is he'd gone into hospital for the flu. And now they find out it's phlebitis, and they find out it's turned out a lot worse. There was an infection, and they had to amputate his left leg. The Bloc Québécois has gone into an emergency caucus meeting, and they're discussing the situation.
Jeffrey, apart from the health matters here, what are the political implications? To so many of us, this party is synonymous with Lucien Bouchard.
Yes, he created it. It has been created in his image, and we don't know because an injury, it's more than an injury. An amputation like this, you don't know whether he can return to public life. If he can return, how active can he be? When can he return?
And also, who's going to take over the leadership of the party on the Hill?
Yeah.
Michel Gauthier, who is the person who sits next to Mr. Bouchard in the House and who is very much there when Mr. Bouchard is not there, is probably going to be the interim leader, one suspects, because he actually has experience as a PQ member in the Quebec legislature, but he certainly doesn't have anything like either the sort of charisma or fluency of Mr. Bouchard.
No, not at all.
He's good at asking questions in the House, and that's about it.
That's it. And he's a very good, he's slightly demagogic, which makes him good in opposition. But, you know, Mr. Bouchard, as we were just saying, he built the party. Party's built in his image. There'll be a huge wave of sympathy for him in the province of Quebec, and I suspect in other parts of Canada too. And it was impossible to know whether that wave of sympathy will assist him if he comes back and promotes Quebec separatism, or whether he'll be able to come back. I mean, we have to remember there was a president of the United States from 1933 to 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, who suffered from polio and effectively couldn't walk. He was handicapped, but nevertheless was a remarkable politician.
But I'm thinking more like Bernard Valcourt, the former minister in the Brian Mulroney government, who lost an eye in an accident, tragically. He came back. He took, 5 months, I believe, and he was back. And other MPs and other cabinet ministers, Roch LaSalle came back from a heart attack, and he never missed a beat.
So to speak.
So to speak. And a lot of people can come back, and it depends. Some will come back quicker, faster than others.
But to lose the leader of the opposition from the daily question period, I mean, I don't think many people outside Ottawa will notice, but my goodness, we'll notice here.
Yeah, and the referendum campaign is already underway in the province of Quebec, and Mr. Bouchard was extremely popular in Quebec, is extremely popular, and was going to be a potent force for separatism in Quebec in the months ahead, and he'll obviously not be able to play that role.
It'll be crucial what role he can play, because he is the one sovereigntist who is most effective in making the emotional argument for Quebec independence. Mr. Parizeau is not good at making that argument. That's an argument that's increasingly important as sort of the way to actually pull Quebecers together. And if Lucien Bouchard is not around to make that argument, it will be interesting to see if that changes the campaign.
It would tend to be a very very dry campaign, a very factual campaign, a lot like Parizeau's speech in Toronto to the Canadian club there.
How potent a force is the Bloc Québécois in Mr. Bouchard's absence?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, because he is so much, as Jeffrey said, the party. There are no other stars that have really emerged in the last year as people who speak, with the exception of Suzanne Tremblay on culture. She's the only MP who I think has got sort of a high recognition factor. Otherwise, I can list off names, but I'm not sure that sort of anyone outside this tiny insulated world would recognize them.
It's also speculative. You know, Mr. Bouchard has spoken in the past of not being a career politician, that there are other things he might like to do with his life, and this kind of a situation may just suggest to him, look, for me, public life is over. I can promote separatism. I still have a name and a force, but I'm, you know, I have 2 young children. I have a younger wife, and I'm out of politics.
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to predict that he'll be back in 3.5 months, and that's
Actually, I think you're right.
And I think he'll fight, and he'll meet the challenge.
Well,
but that's, you know, who knows? That's speculation. But if I had to put a bet, I would bet on that rather than say he leaves politics or something like that.
We will all certainly be watching that with a great deal of interest. I'd like to move on now to one of the week's other big stories on Parliament Hill, gun control. The Justice Minister said this country will define itself to a great degree by its action in gun control. How have we defined the country with this set of proposals?
Well, I think we've defined it in two ways. I think there's one part of the country that thinks like Alan Rock, that we don't need guns to protect us. There are police forces to protect Canadians. And I think there's another group, much smaller group of Canadians. They tend to live in rural areas in many cases, or they tend to live in other areas, smaller towns perhaps, and they feel that they need guns to protect themselves. And I think there's a clash of ideologies there that neither side wants to admit that the other side doesn't think like it does.
Yeah, but you're right. Alan Rock is way ahead in public opinion on this. And the Liberal Party knows that, and Mr. Rock has rather indecently referred to it on a number of occasions in the House of Commons and outside the House of Commons. In the province of Quebec, which is a very important focus for the Liberals, it's overwhelmingly popular.
77 in the last survey. Right. 77%
in urban Canada, which is where a majority of Canadians live, overwhelmingly popular.
Toronto, for instance, where all those Liberals
rural
come
Canada
from.
in some areas, and in the prairies, it's more problematic. So he's on the right side of this issue, and I think he's untouchable on this issue. The Reform Party can throw everything they've got at him. They'll reinforce their own strength with their own voters. That's it.
I agree with you 100% on that.
What about within his own party, though? There is some dissent there.
Not much.
Not much.
I don't think it's very serious.
Inconsequential?
Well, I think at the beginning of the session, when they sort of started rolling on gun control, that there were various members who, the rifle clubs or the gun clubs in their ridings came to them and said, we don't like this. You know, you're going to put restrictions on a legitimate concern. And so there were a legitimate pastime. And there were various MPs who then went to Rock and said, well, just a minute, you know, what's wrong with people target shooting or whatever? But because of the process that the Liberal caucus went through, where in June 2 MPs, Shaughnessy Cohen and Bob Nolt, started a task force, a process whereby they came up with proposals within the caucus, and then in September they invited 10 more members to join them, and then finally they thrashed it out, and they had every Liberal MP who had any concerns on either side of the issue come and talk to them about what the proposals should be. Because they went through that process within caucus, I think there's only 1 or 2 dissidents left.
Jeffrey, take us behind the scenes on this one for a second. One sec, Risha.
Okay.
Jeffrey, would you take us behind the scenes on this one for a second, and to what extent the lobbyists on either side helped to shape this debate and in fact, helped to shape the proposals?
Well, the anti-gun control lobby, I don't know if Charlotte and Richard would agree with me, is better organized and larger than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's a pale shadow of the National Rifle Association in the United States, thank God. The pro-gun control lobby has certainly got Minister Rock's ear. When I have talked to him about this, he'll pull out of his briefcase some statement or some document that they've just come up with. So they obviously have the minister's ear. The anti-gun control people will try to mobilize the population. And there's an irreducible minimum of people, as Richard was suggesting, who oppose any new gun control because they don't like the regulations, they don't like the registration, and they think it's the thin edge of the wedge, that the next thing the government will do, come along, grab their guns,
no more
and
guns.
leave them defenseless against criminals, as you were just saying. So that's an irreducible minimum, but I don't think it has much capacity to grow. I don't believe it's got an appeal beyond those who are already the hardcore now. And I just finished by saying Liberals are doing all kinds of Tory-like things on the deficit because it's so grievous. They therefore need to do some things that make themselves feel good as Liberals, and B, the Liberals have been trying hard to put distance between themselves and the United States. The classic issue to define Canada versus the United States, guns.
This is a nationalist issue as well as a urban-rural issue. But I think, Charlotte, there are more than 2 Liberals. I think it's more like 20 Liberals right now who are dissatisfied, and we could have at least a dozen voting against the legislation.
Now, I bet.
Bet, right? You want to join that bet?
I'll join that bet.
I could be in real trouble.
Right.
We're going to find out in February when the legislation comes out. Now, unless there's lots of major changes and he accommodates them some way. But I'm told from people who are in caucus that there are a lot of people that are very angry on this, and they think just like the Reform does, and they're ready to vote against the party on it.
See this arm? See what a prime minister can do to it when he starts turning it?
But not just that, Richard.
I thought you were going to say they're going to handcuff them.
You talk to MPs about, how big is this an issue in your mailbag? Because that's always what hurts MPs. And except for 2 particular MPs I'm thinking of, it hasn't been an issue for most Liberals at all. And they are just so overwhelming in that caucus. And I think they're like most of us urban Canadians. You think of the horrors that guns have actually perpetrated in this country. We all think of L'École Polytechnique in Montreal, the massacre 5 years ago. And to most Canadians, it simply doesn't make sense that we don't have stronger restrictions on guns. And the Reform Party is particularly upset about the registration rules. And, as everybody from the Prime Minister downwards says, we register cars. What's the big issue about registering guns?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, well, just take, for instance, yesterday when Alan Rock was presenting his plans for next February. He was saying...
Those crib sheets you have ready, Shaw? We just caught a glimpse.
I managed to pick up from Hansard today. Mr. Speaker, he says, one of the defining characteristics of our country is its deep commitment to order and to civility. It's been that way from the beginning. You see, ours is a nation created by consensus, not revolution. And that's the way Alan Rock and Charlotte and Jeff and myself see the country. But it's not the way people like Jack Ramsey, who was 14 years an RCMP constable, and he is now a Reform Party member. He says, we fought in 2 world wars and we used firearms. He says, I come from out west and every settler used a firearm to protect his home from predators. It's part of our culture. It's part of the emotional makeup of people. And he says, as good as law enforcement agencies are, they can't protect us. He says, a random attack on a house in the middle of the night, he says, the police can't protect you against that sort of thing. He says, there's a sense of security that people feel when they have a firearm in the house. Now, that's that minority, and they really believe that. You hear a crook, a thief, a burglar breaking in, you grab your gun and you race downstairs and you blast away. And that's how you protect yourself. And that goes completely contrary to what these, this urban majority thinks in Canada. And that's the crux of the problem. It's 2 different Canadas that we've got there.
But actually, I think that quote isn't representative of the whole Reform Party position. I think I was speaking today to Dr. Grant Hill, who's in the riding just south of Calgary. And what he is really upset about is not he's not upset, not on behalf of people who need to protect themselves, who think, that Canada's crawling with urban burglars who are going to come whipping into their houses at night. He says it's the people among my voters who just use their 22s like, he said, like utensils, because it's a fairly rural riding. I thought it was a terrifying description.
Terrible description at the dinner table?
Yes. I'm not sure where exactly they use them as like utensils, but, for them, It is partly the freedom to bear arms, but it's not in self-protection. It's because it's just a part of their life that they go hunting.
And I think
boy, the psychiatrist could have fun with that one, eh?
Well, I mean, there'll be nights on this show when I'll be taking the government apart, but on this, I think they're right. What they don't like, those people, are the registration requirements. They say, look, we know how to handle firearms. We've got our firearm certificates already. Now you're going to impose additional regulations on us. The Reform Party people generally don't like government regulations, period. And of course, they already feel they're overgoverned, overtaxed, and overregulated. So this new regulation, new registration, fits right into that. That's going to be the flashpoint of the debate. The prohibition into Canada of certain kinds of guns, that's going to go through easily. Minimum sentences for gun-related crimes going up to 4 years from 1. Some civil libertarians will object, but by and large, that's going to go through on the nod.
Okay, just before we go, one quick question to each of you on issues you will be following with some interest in the weeks ahead.
Huh, goodness.
Well, there's one issue that doesn't have a peg, but it's the single most important thing that's happening in Ottawa and will for the next 6 weeks, and that's something called program review. Every department's going through the ringer, and the result is that most of them are going to lose fairly large sums of money and employees, and I think it's going to be the single most dramatic, can I use the dreadful word, downsizing, reduction in size of the federal government that we have seen maybe this century.
And you'll be there. Richard, what's on your plate?
The big story has to be Lloyd Axworthy's reform of social programs. And that the road show is touring across the country. Everywhere they show up, they get brickbats, they get unions, they get students yelling at them. They're having a hard time. This is going to be a very hard sell in the new year.
Quebec next week.
And Quebec next week, Toronto last week, that sort of thing. Finally, there's going to be a report. You're going to hear a lot of noise from a lot of angry people who are on welfare, from the unemployed and from the poor in Canada. And we're finally going to get a left-right issue, the poor, the have against the have-nots.
Okay, Charlotte Gray, what's up for you?
Well, mine is another left-right issue, as it turns out, which is healthcare, and how the health minister, Diane Marleau, is going to actually deal with the clinics in Alberta which are charging facility fees and therefore breaking the conditions of the Canada Health Act. Can Marleau actually keep the Canada Health Act in place?
Okay, thank you all, and we will talk to you again soon.
Bye, Mary.
Bye.
Bye. Up next on Studio 2, World AIDS Day through the eyes of two men living with the disease. Today, December 1st, has been designated World AIDS Day. 10,000 Canadians have AIDS, another 30 to 35,000 have HIV, the virus believed to cause the disease. For these people, every day is AIDS Day, and as those days go by, it becomes increasingly obvious that the battle against AIDS will be long and complicated. With me tonight, two people living with AIDS, Philippe Etier and Tom M., who has asked us not to use his last name. Hi, thank you for coming in.
Sure.
This being World AIDS Day, I'm wondering what it means to you. Does it have a special significance? Is it just like any other day? Tom, what does World AIDS Day mean to you?
Actually, it's just like another day of living with AIDS. It really has, you know, just another day in my life, basically.
Philippe, does it have a significance for you? Or?
Well, I think a lot of it is everyone's aware. I mean, we've seen people on the streets selling the red ribbons, for example, raising money, and I think it's a really important day for people to realize the impact this disease has on everyone. Everyone can think about, oh, it's not going to happen to me, but until it does, they really don't have a clear picture. I mean, it's one day of the year. I wish every day was an AIDS Day, but we have this one particular day that we can focus and really see the impact of it on society.
Have you seen that impact change over the years? Philippe, you've been HIV positive for 9 years. Tom, you have been ill for some of the past 5 years.
Actually, I've been HIV positive for about 5 years, and recently I went from being HIV to having AIDS. So it's kind of weird because it's like testing HIV positive all over again.
Learning that you have AIDS.
Yeah.
How are you? How are you physically?
Well, actually, I've been finding I have to take painkillers at night lately, which I don't really want to. About 2 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, so it was pretty upsetting.
Philippe, you have mentioned a change in awareness, a change in the way people regard people who are HIV positive. What changes have you seen in 9 years?
Well, when I tested positive 9 years ago, everyone was scared and terrified to touch you. I mean, we really didn't know much about HIV infection and the disease itself, and we know you can't get it through the sweat or the palm of the hands. We know we can't get it through using the same utensils. And as more education's getting out there and we're finding out more about the disease, people are becoming more tolerant. It's like when people first started realizing cancer 60 years ago, it's kind of the same reaction. I mean, 20 years, hopefully we'll find a cure by then and people will be more accepting and tolerant, but you still get some stigma attached to it.
Tom, have you seen a change in the way people deal with you now as opposed to the way they did a few years ago? Or as people learn more about the disease, do they change in their acceptance, or is it easier for you to talk to them about it?
Well, actually, it really depends on the kind of people I'm talking with, you know. Like, some people just find it totally unacceptable, and they don't want to really talk to me or be near me, you know. Like, I've been in situations where I've been in a restaurant or something having coffee with people, and a subject comes up, and the people will say things like, I wouldn't even be in a room with somebody with AIDS, and stuff like that. And so that's kind of annoying. You know, because in my mind, the stigma that's attached to this is like, you have there's a lot of shame and a lot of guilt, and I think it's just because of the way it is. Like, people, I think personally, they tend to think that, oh, because you know, you have HIV or AIDS, you must have somehow been bad, like, you know, you were a drug user or a prostitute or something like that, right? And that's totally wrong in my mind.
Where have you found the most support and acceptance, and where the least?
For me personally, most of my support has come from the gay community.
And yet you're not a member of the gay community, right?
Right, I'm a heterosexual, but for the most part, that's where I get all my support. And personally, I think the gay community deserves to be really commended, because they've really, really welcomed this other community, our community, with open arms, you know?
And there has been less than that support in the heterosexual community, you've found?
For me personally, I've found that, right? And I don't know about other people, but that's what I've found.
Philippe, what have you found?
I think what a lot of it is, I mean, I'm gay myself, and I've never really kind of ventured out into the straight community myself because I'm so, I guess, guarded in that respect. But with my family's supportive. 2 years ago, my dad offered me about $2,000 to change my name because he just didn't want to be associated with a son who's HIV infected. And that really hurt, but I've closed that chapter and gone on, because if people are going to have these negative attitudes, or anyone who really has some kind of ignorance toward the disease, I don't want in my life. I think it's just a lack of education, for one, and people just being closed-minded, which is totally wrong.
When you see the headlines in the paper, when you see the news reports of a very promising new drug, of the next AZT, of new clinics, does that bring renewed hope, or does it just all wash by you at this point? Tom, how do you deal with the news, the breakthroughs?
When I see like a promising drug or something in the paper, just me, I don't even bother to read it. You
don't read it?
No, I just flip to the next page.
Why?
I don't know, I just figure that if something miraculous happens in the future, it'll be like headlines, you know? Because there's always different stuff that you read in the paper, right? Like, this is coming through, or this is coming through, and so that's what I tend to do.
Philippe, how do you approach that one breakthrough after the next, or supposed breakthrough after the next?
Well, it's really funny because I don't take any medication right now. I'm more on a holistic approach, and I know like 3 years ago, some mushroom in Japan was supposedly the cure. So after a while, I guess when they do studies on people, they realize that, hey, this doesn't work for everyone. And I really don't pay much attention to it anymore, and I have to agree with Tom. I mean, we hear so much about it that it's so far-fetched. I don't think I'm going to see a cure in my lifetime. Hopefully a control, I think, is more probable. But as far as like there's a new drug out, 3TC, they talk about, and I just kind of flip the page because it doesn't mean anything to me. I really don't, there's got to be more studies done.
Do the people you know who have HIV or who are HIV positive or who have AIDS, is there still hope for a cure, or has everybody come around to the thinking that this will not be cured, it will just be a matter of managing symptoms and managing pain? Do people still think in terms of a cure, or no?
I think everyone is just kind of more hoping for a control. I mean, a control would be nice and wonderful, but we have a lot of people who are sick now. I mean, there's thousands of individuals fighting different diseases through AIDS, and I think right now everyone is just hoping for something to happen. When new drugs come out, they might work for some people, but then again, they don't work for others. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Personally, I think it's going to be quite a while before they actually find a cure for AIDS or a control. I think what they're getting good at is treating our infections, like the stuff that we get sick with. I think they're becoming really good at that. So that's kind of good.
You've both done work, volunteer work on your part, Tom, in the community, the same sort of work that you do, Philippe. Why do you go out into the community and do that sort of work? Why is that important to you?
Well, for me, I belong to the support group for heterosexual and bisexual men, and I used to answer their phones, take their phone calls, and the worst kind of calls that I get would be people phoning me up and saying, "Hi, I just tested positive a couple of weeks ago, and what am I going to do?" You know, so I do this kind of education to try to get through to people, you know. And actually what I do is I'm a recovering addict, and I go to mostly drug rehab centers and talk about living with AIDS and recovery.
And what does that kind of support mean to the people you're dealing with? Is there support? Does support abound for them?
You mean the people in the rehab centers?
The people in the rehab centers, the people you're working with?
I really think that their attitude to some degree changes about people with AIDS, you know, like, and they become a little more supportive. And if anything, they hear a good positive message, you know.
Well, you had a story about a friend of yours. What was that? One of your best friends?
Oh yeah, he's probably watching, but...
He's watching? Can you tell it anyway?
Actually, he's told me a couple of times, he said, you know, when I first met you, he said, I didn't want to be your friend because I knew you had AIDS, and I didn't want to be friends with someone that was most likely going to die on me. But he said, as I got to know you, I couldn't help but be your friend. And I respected that because that was honest to me, you know. And a few of my friends did, when I first tested positive, did it like abandon me. You know, they didn't want to talk to me anymore. And that was kind of tough, but, you know, I survived it.
Philippe, we were talking about the sort of work that you both do and the sort of support.
Well, I've gone across Canada speaking in high schools to young people about being young and living with HIV, because a lot of young people feel that they're immune and that it just won't happen to them. And I think attaching a young face to the disease, it really hits home with them, and you can relate and talk to about the issues. While someone in their 40s might be worried of their job, young people have all their life ahead of you, and when you test positive, it's kind of robbed. And it's kind of a support for me too. If I can just make one person understand the disease, and maybe when they're going to go into sexual relations themselves, think about the issues of safer sex and think about using a latex condom, that's my job's done. And it's kind of supportive too. I mean, I've cried during my speaks, and it's a nice feeling and receptive that you get from the students. It's really nice.
Can you tell us what it's like to live with the knowledge of this disease?
Well, sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's like a nightmare. It really is. Like, just because lately what's been going on in my life, it's like a total nightmare. You know, like sometimes I get really angry when I sit at home and I think, you know, I'm 33 years old, I should be working, and, you know, I should be married and stuff like that, and that kind of stuff isn't going to happen. And it angers me. And once in a while, I get angry at my friends when I see them getting married and having children and stuff, because that kind of stuff is just, for me, is important, was important to me.
Philippe, what is it like for you living with the knowledge of being HIV positive?
Living with the knowledge, I mean, I've had it for so long that it's kind of a term of life. The only thing that really scares me is being alone, and I know I'm not alone, but there's the days you go by and maybe not having a relationship or not having a partner, and those kind of issues stick home. Like as far as children go, I couldn't have kids. Those kind of things seem to be robbed, but I just take it day by day, and I hope that, you know, as every day goes on, that I'm still stay as healthy as I am, and hopefully nothing will happen for a long time anyways.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Philippe. Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
We will be back after this short break. Up next, debating the future of Ontario's forests. One of the most dramatic environmental battles to rage in this country has been over the preservation of forests. Protests to save old-growth forests such as Temagami stir emotion and steal the headlines. But Temagami only represents less than 1% of Ontario's forests. There are 400,000 square kilometres of Crown Forest land, an area larger than Newfoundland, and most of it is being harvested. Besides the devastating effects of clear-cutting, trees are being cut faster than they're being replanted, and they're often replanted with a species which isn't natural to the forest. Experts fear that if harvesting continues as it has, the forests will not be able to sustain themselves. But there is another side to this debate. The forest products industry is a $10 billion business in this province. It represents more than 60,000 jobs and supports nearly 50 communities.
Of Ontario's forests, a classic debate. Everyone agrees something has to be done to make sure the forests don't disappear. But what? The debate has come to a head over a new bill that will become law in Ontario next week. The bill is meant to protect Crown forests and provide better management of the tree harvest. The irony is that this law has become one of the few areas of agreement between environmentalists and the forest industry. They both believe it will do more harm than good. With me to discuss these and other issues is Howard Hampton. He's the Minister of Natural Resources. Marie Router is Executive Director of the Ontario Forest Industries Association. And joining us on the line from Ottawa is Dan Brunton. He's an environmental consultant. Welcome to One and All tonight. Dan, let me get you into this right away. First of all, what we don't want to do is go clause by clause through this bill tonight. What we want to talk about is the forests. And I guess I want to know from you, first of all, how are the forests doing in Ontario right now in your judgment?
I think they're doing about as well and as badly as they've done for some time. I think what we're seeing is essentially a treatment of the issue much as we have for many years.
Minister, where are you on that? How are our forests doing?
The audit, which was completed 2 years ago, indicates that in terms of renewing our forests are being renewed, but our forests are perhaps not being renewed in terms of species terms as well as we'd like them. I would say that generally, if you look at Ontario compared to other jurisdictions, the view is that Ontario's forests are in better shape, that we have not faced the kinds of challenges that British Columbia has faced, that Washington, Oregon has faced, and that, frankly, it's a situation that's being faced in some European jurisdictions.
Okay, let me hear from the industry on how you think the forests are doing. Are they threatened, as we are hearing so often right now?
I don't think the forests are threatened, and I think if you take a look at that audit report and really take a closer look at it, it was done from the time of 1970 to 1985, and even if you look at the differences in numbers from 70 to 85, you see tremendous improvements. And even between 85 and 90 to where we are today, things are getting even better.
How would you define improvements, and how are things getting better? Because I've got to tell you, I think the impression that we have is that
you're absolutely
correct. Is that the forests are disappearing and that the numbers of trees are not being replanted quickly enough and so on.
It's a very misguided impression, and that is what is really unfortunate, is that when we went through the timber environmental assessment hearings, there was a tremendous amount of evidence given there, and it showed that the forests are being renewed. And in fact, some of the recent information that we have from individual companies is that the productivity, in other words, the growth rates in the species are coming back better than what the original forest was. But if I can just say with respect to how our forests are doing today and the number of trees that are replanted, part of our forest comes back naturally, and part of our forest needs some help, and that's the artificial regeneration program.
Is it possible, and this is the classic debate, Mr. Brunton in Ottawa, let me go to you on this. Is it really possible to have a policy that is devised across the province that satisfies what you perceive to be the needs of the environment and what she perceives to be the needs of industry and what the minister perceives to be the commonwealth of the entire province? Is that doable?
I think it's doable if we take a very long view of things. I think the description of the situation that you've just heard from Mr. Hampton and Mrs. Rauter is the view of Ontario through fiber-covered glasses, frankly. We have had a very fiber-oriented view of our forests in government here for many, many years. It isn't just this government, it's going back a century now.
What does that mean, fiber-covered view? What are you trying to say?
It's a real woods product perspective of the forest, that a forest, you're not seeing the forest through the trees, or through the 2x4s perhaps.
Well, what other kind of perspective would you like us to have on it?
We now know, and Mrs. Rauter is a geneticist, she certainly will know this too, that forests are a great deal more than the wood fiber that make them up. Forests are also dynamic systems in which people, animals, plants, and so forth live in tremendous profusion and intermixed, and tremendous relationships which define how the quality of our groundwater and the quality of our very lives can be defined.
We've got a new bill at Queen's Park now that attempts, I think, to identify and to say yes to all of those things that you just pointed out.
It says a number of the right phrases, but it's remarkably not very different from the Crown Timber Act that it's replacing.
Which is a 43-year-old piece of legislation, I think, is it not?
It's more than that. The first version of it was 1849, and its underlying principles in 1849 were really not much different from what we're seeing now. But the problem remains that rather than looking at an ecosystem approach to a resource, a forest, and then saying, once we understand the technical nature of that resource, how can we apply it? What we're looking at is, we want to apply it in this way, and then retrofitting our understanding of it to accommodate our use. We've got it all backwards.
Let me just stick with you for one more second. I don't want to get the minister on that. What do you mean? what did that last thing mean that you just said? Retrofitting this, and we looked at it backwards. I don't get you yet.
Okay. What we're saying is we collectively, the government, the industry, we want to use forests in Ontario to generate a tremendous amount of money. So we will then look back from that and look at the natural resources of Ontario and say, oh, well, here's the rationale for the level of impact on that resource that we're presently having on Ontario. So we've rationalized what we've done by identifying first what we want to do. What we should be doing is identifying first what is sustainable, truly ecologically sustainable, and then saying, this is what we have to work with. Now, if we want to apply a multi-million-dollar forestry industry on that, fair enough, but this is what the cost will be.
Is he right in his characterization of that, Mr. Hampton?
I would say that Mr. Brunton presents an absolutist point of view.
What does that mean?
Well, I think that there are many users of the forest, and many of those users have come together to help us on this act. The Federation of Ontario Naturalists were involved in the drafting, and were there today when we amended one of the last sections. The Northern Ontario Tourism and Outfitters Association, Professor Peter Dunker, who is fast developing a worldwide reputation as someone who understands the dynamics of forest ecosystems.
But your point is you recognize that this is more than just chopping down trees and so on.
Absolutely. In fact, while the existing legislation, the Crown Timber Act, says we should consider the forest for wood fiber first and other values will come later, the reality is that the people who have collaborated in drafting this legislation have all said, we want to turn that around. We want to look at the forest as an ecosystem, and then we want to start to consider the values.
But the Draft Act doesn't say that. The Draft Act says, shall have regard for other values, and as you well know, Mr. Hampton, that shall have regard for is that lovely buzz phrase out of the Planning Act, which allows municipalities, for instance, to think about something and then go on their merry way.
Let's get a response.
I think Mr. Brunton is out of touch. We're dealing with much more than a draft act now. This act has been through 2 readings. It's been through committee hearings across Ontario. There have been a number of amendments. Meetings have been held with a number of environmental groups, local groups, First Nations. So we're dealing with much more than a draft act.
Do you think you have the consensus, though? You know, I guess your job is to balance all of the competing interests here and come up with something that everyone can live with. Have you done that?
Well, I'm not sure you can always achieve consensus. But I think what this act does is it says that now the forest will be considered as an ecosystem. One of the other things it does is that it ensures that for the future we will be investing more money in the forest in terms of renewing the forest.
Well, she will be, you mean?
Where that money comes from over the longer term, we'll see. But certainly industry will be paying more money, and I think that's a good thing for a number of reasons.
We're not going to go clause by clause through this, but tell me, generally speaking, you know, you do have a problem with this act? What's your problem with it?
We have a number of concerns with the bill, and in terms of where some of the environmentalists are coming from, I think we're on side is that if this is a Crown Forest Sustainability Act, it should encompass the umbrella legislation that would be umbrella for all of the activities in the Crown Forest, and then the forest industry would only be one component of that.
But do you feel, particularly targeted by this thing? Is that your problem with it?
Well, this act is targeted for the forest industry and the forest industry activities. But if I could come back to a comment that Mr. Brunton made earlier with respect to sustainability, that is one of the things that I think we want very desperately. We want sustainable development, and one component of sustainable development is sustainable forests.
Okay, let me ask you one simple question. If you chop down one tree, should you have to replant that tree in order to get a new license to chop down another tree?
If we chop down one tree, we must ensure that at least one more tree, probably more than one tree, is renewed. It may be artificially planted, it may come in naturally. We want to try and mimic as close as possible to nature. And so some of the prologue for the introduction was that the species that are being planted here are not necessarily the same that were there. It is the same, and we're very concerned that we get the same kind of natural species, native species, back on the sites where we have harvested.
Mr. Brunton, what's so unreasonable about you chop one down, you plant a new one in its place?
No, that's a very good, I'm pleased to hear what she's saying, and I agree with most of what she's saying. I think that one of the concerns we have is the manner in which it's done and the scale in which it's done. We certainly don't want Northern Ontario turned into one giant tree farm with nice straight rows of planted pine. I was pleased to hear Mrs. Rutter refer to planting trees back of the species that was cut, because what happens frequently now is that a forest will be cut and converted into a plantation of more desirable species, commercially desirable stems. This is going on, or has been going on, even in places like Algonquin Park, where jack pine would be cut out and red pine and white pine would be replanted. This is ecologically a real problem.
I know one of the original problems the bill had was that while it said it was interested in sustainability, and that's because that's become such a great buzzword these days, right? Everybody wants to practice good sustainable development. It actually didn't say what the heck that meant.
And it still doesn't.
Have you? Well, I was going to ask Mr. Hampton. Have you fixed that, Mr. Forgive me, Mr. Brunton apparently doesn't think you have.
I think that, in fact, we're probably on the leading edge in the world now in terms of the indicators that have been put either into the legislation or into the manuals. The approach here is not to write everything in the legislation. The approach is to write a blueprint in the legislation and then provide manuals that people who work in the forest, whether they're wildlife biologists or whether they're foresters or fisheries biologists, can then use those manuals in terms of everyday planning and meeting indicators and meeting criterion. So if somebody says, well, I want to see every dot and dash in the Act in a province that is as diverse as Ontario, that hasn't been the approach. But, for example, we've worked closely with the Canadian Forestry Service in terms of taking some of the indicators of forest sustainability that are being worked on around the world under the auspices of the United Nations, and we've built them into the manuals. And the manuals will have the force of law under this legislation.
To that end, Mr. Brunton, you were called an absolutist by the minister here a little while earlier, and I want to
called worse.
And I want to get a sense about what you think that means. Are you in favor of any cutting down of trees at all in natural areas in Ontario?
What do you mean by natural area? As a legislated natural area, a reserve, or just natural lands?
What's your attitude towards logging? You against any logging of any kind?
Certainly not. Logging is a really important industry in Ontario, and it always will, I suspect. I think it's a desirable and important industry, particularly in the north. What I am against is when we focus a forest, which is so much more than the logging, as Mrs. Rauter has very correctly pointed out, and say this is what we're going to do, everything we do to this place on behalf of. That's far too narrow a focus. You know, and when the minister says that we have defined sustainability, which is really a fundamental point, he's quite wrong. It isn't defined. It's defined when you look up sustainability in the Act. It simply says, see the policy manual that's to be developed. So here we have a fundamental philosophical foundation of the whole document, and it has no definition except in some bureaucrat's mind.
I'm afraid Mr. Brunton's been out of the loop. The fact is, when we started the drafting of the Act, we recognized that we were going to have to go through a consultation process, and we recognized there would be a great deal of public input. And so we left some of those sections for that. Mr. Brunton is dealing with the first draft of the Act. A lot has happened since then. A lot has been written in terms of how you define sustainability. A lot has been worked out in the manuals in terms of how you apply those definitions of sustainability, the indicators you will test by, and how you'll be held accountable. So
I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Well,
I'd love to be in the loop. I'm just a member of the public of Ontario. I haven't been advised of it.
No, I think you should contact the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, who've done almost daily work on this, who actually sat down and drafted with us specific sections, who are, right now as we speak in Sault Ste. Marie, working on the manuals, which will become the application.
I have to agree with you, Dan, and some of the things that you're saying with respect to the definition of sustainability is that, yes, the definition for sustainability has been improved from the first reading. However, it's still very much a philosophical definition. And we as an industry where we're going in and harvesting, we would like to have much more concrete criteria. And one of our concerns is that, yes, these manuals are currently being written and these guidelines are currently being written, but we really still don't know what's in them. Yeah. And so the minister is absolutely correct. It is enabling legislation, but because it's enabling legislation, there's a lot of trust me, and we're going to have to wait until those are completed.
It's a blank check.
One of the things that the Act, I believe, does require of you is the creation of these new trust funds, which your business is going to have to pay into.
That's right.
You have a problem with that at all?
We're very supportive of that, and it's actually already in the old Crown Timber Act because there was a revision put in June, so that is already in place. And I can tell you that the industry is if I can use the word ecstatic about that. One of the reasons being is that now there is dedicated funding for renewal. And that can only, those dollars can only go to renewal. And it will go back to the areas that have been harvested to ensure that we get good quality forests back again. So we're very, very supportive of that.
Is anybody here concerned about what this bill is going to do to communities in the north, which are one industry towns that depend entirely on this business, on logging, on chopping down trees?
Well, I think to be fair, most of those communities, and I live in one.
Yeah, you're from Rainy River, we should say.
That's right. And most of those communities, in fact, see the forest as fulfilling a number of roles. Many of the folks who live in northern Ontario own a cabin, a cottage, a camp on the lake. Many like to fish, many like to hunt, many like to hike, as well as work in the forest or a mill that's dependent on the forest.
Is there anything here that would threaten their way of life, their communities, their ability to make a living?
I think if you judge by what, on the one hand, by what the market is saying in terms of the investments in Ontario forest industries, we are experiencing more intensive investment in our forest industries this year than even British Columbia. And that investment looks like it's going to go up next year based upon the spending that is calculated.
Is he right about that?
There is investment, but if I can just give you some background of where that investment is coming from, is much of that investment is because there has been poplar and birch that has been freed up, and so many of this is for new industry. However, for the existing industry, there has not been a whole lot of investment to date. We will be doing more investment next year, and that is because we have just come through a 5-year recession where we have not been spending very much money in terms of maintenance and upgrades, and so there will be considerable dollars spent there. There will also be, and my latest estimate is somewhere between $350 and $400 million to meet and improve environmental standards for mills because of both federal and provincial legislation.
Mr. Brunton, I got about 30 seconds left. You want to take the last 30 and tell me what you think the ramifications of this will be on communities?
I like the idea of investment because this is an investment in our future. As someone has said, we don't own the land, we hold it for our grandchildren, and that's very true. These small communities have to have investments because we all citizens of Ontario have an investment in our forests, not just in the trees that turn into 2x4s.
Okie doke. On that note, Mr. Brunton, Ms. Rauter, Minister Hampton, thank you so much for coming in tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right back after this.
Next on Studio 2, the ups and downs of modern dance.
The whimsy of Cirque du Soleil, the grace of an athlete, the beauty of flight. Choreographer Deborah Brown has taken her background in acrobatics and dance to new heights. The stage for her latest production? A trampoline. The show is called Apogee, and it recently had its world premiere in Toronto.
It started with this simple project to find a solution. Is it possible to create emotional content out of simple movements on a trampoline as opposed to the normal flips and saltos that acrobatics do to give you that kinetic sense? That's the original inspiration, but along the way, when we found that simple movements could have an expression of some sort, you could feel some emotional content in it, the story developed from there. Once I had a dream about choreographing a piece in a telephone booth with Houdini hanging upside down. It's a dream. One day I'd like to fulfill it. apogee means the furthest point in the moon's orbit from the Earth. And I chose that title because, first of all, the sound, apogee, and because it's a point in space. That's what this piece is about, points in space. It's about the vertical space as opposed to the dance floor. The suspension, the points of suspension when you rise before you fall. Well, I've always enjoyed using props that have been used for normally outstanding athletic feats and trying to find other ways of expression with the same prop. I don't actually come from a circus background. I used to be a gymnast when I was young, and then I studied dance, and then I discovered circus. But my passion has always been in movement. I have to say that I love illusion. I love it when the physical body can create a simple illusion, I love the purity of the body in motion. And I believe the trampoline accents that 100%. It's a dance floor. It's every choreographer's dance floor dream.
You can see the Cirque du Soleil influence, eh?
I'm still trying to figure out how they bounce this way. How do you Anyway.
We're out of time.
We're out of time. We have a great guest tomorrow night.
Yes.
I'm excited about this.
Yes.
Rita Shirelli is coming here tomorrow night. Rita Shirelli, for those of you who don't know, and she hasn't, you know, she's not made it big time like Tony Bennett yet, so maybe you wouldn't know, but she will one of these days.
Drop.
She's a Hamilton native, as all good people are.
What a surprise.
She is a leather-lunged belter. She has the greatest deep voice, great blues singer.
Deep as yours?
No.
Tomorrow at 8.
Tomorrow at 8. She'll be here. Okay, see you.